Helping volunteering, or is that staying the same?
I think it's starting to change. I think there was some churches that came on board fairly early in the epidemic, and certainly there's been a whole lot of work in the last several years to kind of get more churches on board in terms of kind of organizing or doing more work around like HIV/AIDS. I think it's really complicated. I think one of the questions I have about it is, whereas I think that there's definitely like a role for churches to play in that, I think we need many approaches, I guess is what I think. Because there's also there's a way in which just quite frankly, like, in the Black community, and I could say probably in our largest society, like churches just don't have the same level of like power and play the same role in people's everyday lives in most communities, right? And so I think that can work for people who, are in church and are going. I think that would, but then I also think that there needs to be a different set of players and a different set of like kind of approaches for people who don't, right? And it's often not just, but often like people who don't, for not just because they don't go to church, but for like lots of other reasons, like kind of socioeconomic status, all these things. Like those are the folks that are actually most at risk in the community. So yeah, I think we need more. Churches are starting to kind of come on board, but we need a whole multitude of approaches.
You've spoken about gender and sexism and how that was really focused on in the film, and also that was really about the beginning. I also wonder, with today, the face of AIDS in America, HIV is heterosexual Black females. Mm-hmm. How has that affected? Do you hear from your there's like people who go to communities in a sense, or families? Does that make homosexuality or LGBTQ more suspect in Black communities because of men who say they're straight but really engaging in same-sex acts or at high risk?
Oh, the DL question. Okay. Yes. Although let me say uncategorically that the sort of, and I just finished writing a piece about this that I'm talking to a publisher about right now, an article. The myth that like men on the down low, meaning men who identify publicly as heterosexual but who are having other kinds of sexual or romantic relationships with other men, right? But are with Black women or whatever. The myth that they are the reason that rates of HIV are high among Black women in this country is categorically false. It's false, and I get mad every time I see it on the TV or hear it on the radio because it's so not true. Like, it's not true. I'm gonna come back to why in a second. I think that some of the other issues, I think, and I didn't talk about this, I should have probably more specifically, but even going back to the civil rights period, which I think influenced the civil rights movement and like patriarchy within the movement, and affects public policy where Black women are concerned to this very day, is the Moynihan Report. Right, so the Moynihan Report was this report that was commissioned by New York State Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, right? Just died a few years ago. And he wanted to look at why the Black community wasn't progressing, or why like the socioeconomic issues in the Black community, what were the sort of indigenous problems. He's like, enough about like racism and whatever, institutional racism, but like, what are the things within the Black community, like culturally or socially, that are impacting people's ability to sort of, the Black community's ability to like progress, quote unquote, or move ahead or whatever. And his theory was that, you see I'm rolling my eyes, you see how I think about that theory. The theory was that because Black communities' households were the opposite of what was right for civilization, which meant that, because Black women, supposedly were the head of households in the Black community and wielded all this power in the Black community, in Black families, leaving Black men with no power and no, because they couldn't be the sort of like stand-up patriarchs that men in other cultures are supposed to be, that like was socially dysfunctional, and that was the reason why the black community could not progress, right? Garbage, utter garbage. I don't even have enough time to get into all of that, why it's garbage. But what that unfortunately had, that report, unfortunately, a lot of black men in the movement took that up, right? So there's still this notion to this very day that like, what it means to be like radical, or what it means to be like how the black community is going to progress. Like one of the main narratives is like black men have to stand up and be the rightful patriarchs or whatever, which obviously diminishes like the role and importance of black women, and maybe black women are the ones who need to like lead the movement or whatever, and certainly like not black queer folks, right? I mean, there was a lot of stuff and I mean, Elaine Brown and Angela Davis, Gwendolyn Zahara Simmons from SNCC, all these women have written and talked ad nauseum about all the different battles within the different like black power movements that were, that they had to kind of deal with as women. But also, then there was also this thing around like then black gay men in particular, right? Because we were seen as, antithetical to kind of human development, right? Or what it meant to be a man, right? So we, because there were all these jokes. Eldridge Cleaver, used to call James Baldwin Martin Luther Queen, and all this kind of stuff, and then all of the other stuff that happened with Bayard Rustin through like the Black Power folks also attacked him vehemently around gender and sexuality. Because actually some of this Bayard's politics I don't necessarily agree with. He was far too accommodationist for me personally. But I think that that's a political distinction. There were some people who, use that to attack his sexuality. So wait, where I lost myself in the question. So black women, right? Okay, so back to the DL thing. Okay, so why that's false is, first of all, why this notion that like, this high rates of black women with HIV is directly correlates to like all these men on the DL. First of all, there aren't all these men on the DL. And every study that's been done like shows that there's not like some high population of black men who are identified as straight and like running around having, unprotected sex with women. In fact, there was a study that was done in 2005 by one good friend of mine, one other person I know, David Milbranch, was down at Emory University, who did this as a public health specialist and a doctor, an MD, who did this study that actually showed that like even among like black men who are like bisexual, who are having, who don't disclose their, homosexual tendencies to their female partners, actually take more precautions and actually have less HIV than black gay men who are out do, right? And that study was confirmed by another one. The thing that first made me suspicious of, well, there's lots of things that made me suspicious of the DL conversation, but one of the major things is, as somebody who, also really looks at like kind of prisons and the rise of prisons in our society, one of the narratives is that, well, with so many black men in prison or in and out of prisons and jails in the U.S. that, that because of having unprotected sex with other men in prison or whatever, is the reason for high rates of transmission outside. What makes that argument suspicious is that, well, first of all, the CDC did a study in the state of Georgia that kind of disproved that last year. But before that came out, if you look at rates of HIV among prisoners, both men in prison and women in prison, rates of HIV are much higher among women in prison than they are among men in prison, right? And we know that, if we would assume that like people are contracting HIV because of being locked up in prisons, we know that sex between women is one of the most like least risky